Something strange is happening in Ryan Cole's life. 10 years ago, his world shattered when his little daughter vanished without a trace. He spent years searching, following every lead, chasing ghosts in the wind, until one day, he was forced to let go. But just as he started to accept his loss, the past came knocking at his door. A mysterious blue envelope, a photograph that shouldn't exist, a voice on the phone calling him daddy. Nothing makes sense anymore, and the deeper he digs, the more he realizes. Someone has been lying to him all along. His wife's death, his daughter's disappearance. The life he thought he had moved on from. What if none of it was real? And when he finally reaches the truth, will he be ready to face it? Get ready for an unforgettable story full of shocking secrets, heartbreaking betrayals, and a final twist that will leave you breathless. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, the kind that made Ryan Cole's skin crawl. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the cold case file that had haunted him for the past 10 years. His daughter, Emily, had vanished without a trace, and no matter how much time passed, he could never shake the feeling that she was still out there somewhere, waiting for him to find her. He had given up the official investigation years ago, forced to accept that the trail had gone cold, but something inside him refused to let go. And then, just when he thought he had finally come to terms with his loss, a letter arrived. A single blue envelope placed in his mailbox with no return address. His hands trembled as he held it, his breath shallow. It was the kind of blue that reminded him of the sky on the morning Emily disappeared, that hauntingly perfect shade that now carried nothing but pain. He opened the envelope with careful fingers, half expecting it to be some cruel joke. But the moment he saw the handwriting inside, his heart stopped. It was hers, his wife, Claire. But Claire was dead. She had been gone for 8 years. Yet, there it was, her familiar cursive, the way she always looped her L's, the small smudge of ink at the edge, just like she used to do when she wrote in a hurry. His throat tightened as he read the single sentence written inside. She is alive, and they have her. His vision blurred as he read the words over and over, his fingers gripping the edges of the paper so tightly that it crumpled beneath his touch. No, this wasn't possible. Claire had died. Emily had been gone for a decade. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But then, as if the universe wanted to prove him wrong, a photograph slipped from the envelope and landed on his desk. His entire body froze. It was a picture of a girl. She was standing near a window, her face partially obscured by the glare of the sunlight. But even with the distortion, he knew those eyes. They were Emily's eyes, his daughter's. But the girl in the picture wasn't 2 years old. She was older, 10 years older, exactly the age Emily would be today. His breath hitched as he ran his fingers over the photo, his mind racing. Who had sent this? Who had been watching her all these years? And why now? His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, dialing the only person he could trust with something like this. "Mark," he said the moment the call connected, his voice raw. "I need you to come over. Now." Mark Reynolds had been his best friend since their academy days, and even after Ryan left the force, Mark had remained his closest confidant. They had worked together on Emily's case, and Mark had been there to pick up the pieces when Ryan lost Claire. But even Mark had told him to let go, to move on. Now, Ryan needed him to see this, to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. Within 20 minutes, there was a knock at his door. Ryan swung it open to find Mark standing there, his brows furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" Ryan didn't speak. He simply handed him the letter and the photograph, watching as Mark's face twisted with disbelief. "Ryan," he started, but then he stopped, staring at the picture. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my mailbox," Ryan said, pacing the room. No return address, no indication of who sent it, just Claire's handwriting. "Mark, she's been dead for 8 years." Mark looked up at him, his expression unreadable. "You're sure it's her handwriting?" Ryan shot him a look. "I would know it anywhere." Mark exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. This could be a sick joke. Maybe someone got their hands on an old letter from her and— "Don't," Ryan interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't tell me it's a joke. Look at that picture. That's my daughter. That's Emily. And she's alive." Mark hesitated for a long moment before nodding. "All right, let's figure this out." Ryan's mind was already racing with possibilities. If Emily was alive, where had she been for the last 10 years? Who had taken her? And more importantly, why was someone reaching out to him now? His instincts told him this was no coincidence. Whoever had sent this letter wanted him to find her. That night, sleep was impossible. Ryan sat at his desk, staring at the photo until the first light of dawn crept through his window. The morning felt heavy, suffocating, and as he stepped outside to clear his mind, something caught his eye. A small figure stood across the street, just barely visible in the early morning mist. A child. A little girl. His breath caught in his throat. She was standing near a row of garbage bins, motionless, watching him. Something about her sent a chill down his spine. Her dress was white, slightly too big for her small frame, and her dark hair fell in loose curls around her face. But it was her eyes that froze him in place. They were too knowing, too deep for a child that young. Ryan took a step forward. "Hey, sweetheart, are you lost?" The girl didn't answer. She simply lifted her small hand and pointed at one of the garbage bags behind her. Ryan's heart pounded. "What is it?" he asked, taking another step closer. But before he could reach her, she turned and ran, disappearing down the alley. He hesitated for only a second before his instincts kicked in. He rushed toward the garbage bags, hands shaking as he tore one open. Inside, among crumpled papers and discarded items, was another blue envelope. His breath came in short gasps as he snatched it up and ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and as his eyes scanned the words, his knees nearly buckled beneath him. "She is waiting for you. Go to the farmhouse." His mind spun. The farmhouse. There was only one place that could mean Claire's childhood home, but it had been abandoned for years. Why would Emily be there? And then a new thought struck him. He turned, searching for the little girl, but she was gone. A shiver ran down his spine. Who was she? How had she known to lead him here? And why did he have the strangest feeling that he had seen her before? His grip tightened on the envelope. There was only one way to find out. He had to go to the farmhouse. And he had to go now. The road stretched out before him like an endless ribbon of faded asphalt, winding through the desolate countryside. Ryan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind a storm of thoughts as he drove toward the farmhouse. It had been years since he had last set foot there, years since Claire had spoken of the place with the kind of sadness that made him wonder why she avoided it so much. He had never questioned her reluctance to return, but now, with everything unraveling before him, he realized he should have. His daughter might be there, and if she was, it meant that someone had been hiding her for a decade. The idea made his chest tighten. Who had kept her away from him? And why? The letter burned in his pocket, its weight far heavier than a simple piece of paper should have been. He had read the words over and over on the drive, trying to decipher their deeper meaning, trying to find hidden messages between the lines. "She is waiting for you. Go to the farmhouse." It was simple, direct, but it made no sense. Who had written it? Claire? No, she was gone. No, he couldn't let his mind go there. He had buried her, mourned her, spent years trying to move on. She couldn't be alive. But then again, Emily was supposed to be gone too. His fingers curled tighter around the steering wheel. The early morning light had begun to seep through the sky, painting it in soft shades of gray and blue. He was close now, the familiar silhouette of the farmhouse coming into view. It stood there, silent and forgotten, surrounded by tall, swaying grass that had long since overtaken the gravel driveway. The sight of it sent an involuntary shiver through him. He pulled the car to a stop and sat there for a moment, gripping the keys in the ignition, listening to the soft hum of the engine. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, as if time had stopped in this place. He could almost hear Claire's voice in his memory, telling him how she hated this house, how she had spent her childhood wanting nothing more than to escape it. And yet someone had brought Emily here. Why? Slowly, he stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like distant whispers. The front porch loomed before him, its wooden boards weathered and cracked from years of neglect. He hesitated for only a second before reaching out and pushing the door open. The house smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of scent that carried the weight of forgotten memories. Sunlight streamed through the broken blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything was still, too still. His pulse pounded in his ears as he took careful steps forward, scanning the room. The furniture was covered in sheets, as if someone had abandoned the place in a hurry but still expected to return someday. Then he saw it. A small stuffed bear sat in the middle of the living room floor. His breath caught in his throat. He knew that bear. It had been Emily's favorite, the one she had clutched to her chest every night as she fell asleep. He had searched for it after she disappeared, desperate to find even the smallest trace of her, but it had been gone. And now, here it was, sitting in the middle of an abandoned farmhouse. His fingers trembled as he knelt down and picked it up. It was worn, as if time had not been kind to it, but the embroidered name on the back was still visible. Emily. His heart ached as he ran his thumb over the stitching. This was real. This was hers. She had been here. A floorboard creaked above him. He froze. His head snapped up, his breath shallow. Someone was here. Slowly, carefully, he rose to his feet, his pulse hammering in his chest. He scanned the room, listening. The silence stretched on for a moment too long. And then another sound, soft footsteps, barely audible, moving across the floor above him. He took a step toward the staircase, every instinct in his body on high alert. Emily? His voice came out barely above a whisper, but even still it felt too loud in the quiet house. No answer. He swallowed hard and took another step, the old wooden stairs groaning beneath his weight as he climbed. He reached the landing, glancing down the narrow hallway. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the slivers of light leaking through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The doors along the hall were all closed, except one. The door at the very end of the hall stood slightly ajar, a thin stream of light spilling out from inside. His heart pounded. He took a breath, steeling himself, and stepped forward. The room was empty. It was a bedroom, untouched by time, filled with old furniture that had once belonged to Claire's parents. A single rocking chair sat by the window, gently swaying, as if someone had just been there. His eyes scanned the space, searching for anything, any sign, any clue. And then, his gaze landed on the small desk near the corner. A single blue envelope sat on top of it. His blood ran cold. Slowly, he walked toward it, his hands unsteady as he reached for it. He tore it open, his breath caught in his throat as he read the words inside. "You are not ready for the truth." A chill ran down his spine. The sound of movement echoed behind him. He turned sharply, but the hallway was empty. The house was silent once more. His fingers tightened around the letter. Someone was playing a game with him. Someone who knew things he didn't. And he was done waiting for answers. He was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Ryan stood in the middle of the dimly lit bedroom, the blue envelope trembling in his hands. The words on the page haunted him. "You are not ready for the truth." His pulse pounded in his ears, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who had written this? And more importantly, if he wasn't ready for the truth, what was he supposed to do? His instincts screamed that he wasn't alone in this house, that someone had been there, watching him, moving just beyond his reach. He turned sharply, scanning the room, searching for any sign of movement, but the house had once again fallen into an unsettling silence. His breath came in uneven gasps as he carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the worn edges of Emily's stuffed bear, still clutched tightly in his other hand. The weight of it grounded him, reminded him why he was here. If Emily had been in this house, if she was still out there, he had to find her. And whoever had left this message, they knew something. His gaze fell on the rocking chair by the window, its slow, steady movement unnatural in the absence of wind. Someone had been sitting there moments ago. He took a step closer, heart hammering against his ribs, reaching out to touch the back of the chair. The wood was still warm. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, echoed from the hallway. A whisper of movement, the gentle shift of floorboards under careful steps. Ryan turned sharply toward the door. The hallway stretched out before him, bathed in shadows, the open doorway at the end of the hall now completely closed. His breath caught. He had left it open. Someone had closed it. His entire body tensed as he stepped out into the hallway, each step deliberate, careful, his pulse thundering in his ears. His fingers grazed the wall for support as he approached the door, his other hand instinctively reaching for the handle. It was cold beneath his touch. He pushed it open. The room beyond was dark. The air was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and forgotten memories pressing down on him like a weight. He reached for the light switch, flicking it on. Nothing happened. The single window in the room was boarded shut, allowing only thin slivers of light to filter through the cracks, casting jagged patterns across the floor. The room was empty, yet it felt occupied, like something lingered in the air, something unseen, something waiting. Ryan's gaze swept the space, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the single object placed deliberately in the center of the room. A photograph. His breath hitched as he stepped closer, kneeling down to pick it up. His fingers brushed against the old, worn edges, the paper slightly curled from age. But when he turned it over, his heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of Claire. She was standing outside the farmhouse, the wind catching her hair, a gentle smile playing at her lips. But it wasn't the image itself that sent a shiver through him. It was the date scrawled in ink on the back. 6 years ago. Ryan's throat went dry. That wasn't possible. Claire had been dead for 8 years. A sharp inhale of breath filled the silence. It wasn't his. Ryan spun around, heart pounding. The hallway behind him was empty, the air thick with the suffocating weight of something unseen. The floorboards creaked, but he wasn't moving. Someone was here. His fingers clenched around the photograph as he took a slow step forward, his senses on high alert. He needed to get out of this house. He needed to regroup to figure out what this meant. If this photograph was real, if Claire had been alive 2 years after her supposed death, then everything he knew was a lie. And if everything was a lie, what had really happened to Emily? He made his way back down the stairs, each creaking step echoing through the hollow house. The living room loomed before him, the stuffed bear still lying abandoned on the floor where he had left it. His car keys burned in his pocket, a reminder that he could leave at any moment. But something deep inside him told him there was more to find here. A glint of metal caught his eye. On the kitchen counter, barely visible under a thin layer of dust, sat an old key. Ryan hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward and picking it up. The cold metal pressed against his palm as he turned it over, searching for any indication of what it belonged to. It was old, worn from time, and attached to a single faded tag. The words were barely legible, but as he squinted, he could just make out the faint letters. Safe house. A sharp knock echoed from the front door. Ryan stiffened. His grip on the key tightened as he turned toward the entrance, his breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard a car pull up, hadn't seen anyone approach. Another knock, slower this time, more deliberate. Ryan stepped forward, every muscle in his body tense as he reached for the doorknob. He turned it, pulling the door open. The porch was empty. His heart slammed against his ribs as he stepped outside, scanning the overgrown field that stretched out before him. Nothing. No sign of anyone. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the tall grass, but the air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy. Then he saw it. Another blue envelope. It was lying on the porch floor, placed neatly just outside the doorway. His stomach twisted as he bent down and picked it up, his fingers unsteady as he tore it open. This time, the message inside was different. Stop searching. Ryan's grip on the paper tightened, his jaw clenching. Whoever was behind this wanted him to walk away, but they had underestimated him. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. Because if Claire had been alive 6 years ago, then maybe, just maybe, Emily was still out there too. And he was going to find her. No matter what it took. Ryan stood on the porch, his fingers tightening around the blue envelope, the paper crinkling beneath his grip. Stop searching. The words echoed in his mind. A direct warning. A challenge. Someone knew he was looking. Someone wanted to scare him into turning back. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. He had spent 10 years grieving, searching, losing himself in the absence of answers. And now, when the truth was finally within reach, he wasn't about to let it slip away. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass surrounding the farmhouse, carrying the scent of earth and distant rain. The world felt heavier, as if pressing down on him, urging him to reconsider. But he ignored the weight in his chest, stuffing the letter into his pocket before stepping off the porch. His car sat where he had left it, dust clinging to the windshield, the morning light casting long shadows across the dirt road leading away from the house. His fingers curled around the old key in his pocket. Safe house. The word lingered in his mind. Was it a place Claire had known? A place she had been hiding? If she had left that key behind, it had to mean something. And if she had been alive 6 years ago, where had she gone? Why had she never reached out to him? His thoughts spiraled as he slid into the driver's seat, his pulse steady but urgent. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Turning the key in the ignition, the car rumbled to life, and he pulled away from the farmhouse, watching it shrink in the rearview mirror. The road stretched before him, empty and endless, the silence pressing against his ears. He hadn't driven more than a few miles when his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number. His stomach twisted. He hesitated for a moment before reaching for it, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a steady breath, he answered. Ryan. A woman's voice whispered on the other end. His grip on the wheel tightened. Who is this? A pause. You have to stop, she said, her voice shaking. You don't understand what you're walking into. Ryan's heart pounded. Who are you? Another pause. Then softly, I never wanted you to find out this way. His breath caught. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. But it couldn't be. Claire. Silence. His chest constricted, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Where are you? His voice was desperate now, raw with years of pain and unanswered questions. Claire, if that's you, if you're alive, you have to tell me where you are. You shouldn't have gone to the farmhouse, she whispered. They know now. They'll be watching. Ryan felt his pulse hammering against his skull. Who's watching? The line went dead. He pulled the car to a sharp stop on the side of the road, his breath coming in short gasps. His heart was racing, his mind spinning. That voice. It was Claire. He knew it deep in his bones. But how? How could she be alive? And why, after all these years, was she warning him to stop searching? He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the phone screen, hoping she would call back. But the seconds ticked by in silence. No, he wasn't stopping now. He grabbed the key from his pocket, turning it over in his palm. Safe house. If Claire had left it behind, it meant she had been there. Maybe she still was. He needed to find it. But where? Then it hit him. He reached for his phone again, pulling up the police database he still had access to from his years on the force. He typed in the word safe house, filtering through abandoned properties, looking for anything that might fit. Took less than a minute. A cabin, 50 miles north, a property Claire's parents had once owned. Ryan didn't hesitate. He shifted the car back into gear and took off down the highway, the speedometer climbing as the trees blurred past. The sun had risen higher now, burning through the mist, but the weight in his chest didn't lift. He had been chasing ghosts for so long, and now, finally, he was getting close. The drive felt endless, his fingers gripping the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Every time he blinked, he saw Claire's face, heard the way her voice had cracked through the phone. She had sounded afraid. Why? And why, after all this time, had she stayed hidden? By the time he reached the cabin, the sun hung high in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the overgrown dirt path leading up to the house. The place was small, unassuming, nestled between towering pines. It looked untouched, abandoned, but something about it felt occupied. Ryan parked the car and stepped out, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The air smelled of damp wood and pine needles, the world unnervingly silent. He approached the front door, testing the handle. Locked. His pulse quickened. He pulled the old key from his pocket, his fingers unsteady as he slid it into the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the door creaked open. The inside was dim, dust particles floating in the thin beams of sunlight filtering through the curtains. The furniture was covered in white sheets, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten time. But the kitchen table, unlike the rest of the house, was different. It was clean, used, and in the center of it sat another blue envelope. Ryan's breath hitched. He stepped forward, his fingers grazing the edges before he picked it up. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the words inside. She remembers you. His heart clenched. Emily. She was alive, and she remembered him. His fingers trembled as he lowered the letter, his mind racing. This was real. This wasn't some cruel joke. His daughter was alive. Then, behind him, a floorboard creaked. Ryan's body tensed. He turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was a woman. Her hair was longer, her frame thinner, but her eyes were the same. Claire. Alive. His breath caught, the room spinning around him. She stared at him, tears brimming in her eyes. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Ryan felt everything collapse inside him. His wife wasn't dead. She had never been dead. And she had been here all this time. The weight of 10 years crashed down on him. An avalanche of grief, anger, and desperate relief. He stepped forward, his voice breaking. Claire. Her lips trembled. And then, in the softest whisper, I'm so sorry. The world tilted. Ryan had spent years searching for the truth. But now, standing in front of his wife, the wife he had buried, the truth felt more terrifying than he had ever imagined. Ryan's world tilted on its axis as he stood frozen in the doorway of the cabin, staring at the woman he had mourned for 8 long years. Claire. Alive. Breathing. Standing just a few feet away, looking at him with those same eyes that had haunted his dreams for nearly a decade. His chest felt tight, his lungs refusing to take in air, as if his body couldn't comprehend the reality of what was in front of him. She looked different, thinner, paler, her hair longer, strands of gray peeking through the dark waves. Her clothes were simple, worn, as if she had been living off the grid for years. And yet, despite all the changes, she was still her. The same woman he had loved, the same woman he had buried. But she wasn't dead, and that realization made his hands clench into fists. His voice cracked as he finally forced out a single word. How? Claire flinched, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for the storm she knew was coming. Her eyes were filled with something unreadable. Regret, fear, sorrow. Ryan, she whispered, her voice fragile, as if saying his name might break her. He shook his head, taking a step closer. No, you don't get to say my name like that. You died, Claire. I buried you. I spent years trying to understand why you were taken from me. And now you're just here. His voice cracked under the weight of all the grief he had carried, all the nights spent drowning in the loss of her. How is this possible? Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. I had to leave. Ryan's stomach twisted violently. The way she said it, like it had been a choice, like she had chosen to disappear, to let him believe she was dead. His pulse thundered in his ears. You had to. His voice was dangerously low, his hands shaking at his sides. No, Claire, you don't get to say that. You don't get to stand here after all these years and act like this was some kind of necessity. His breath hitched. I mourned you. Do you understand that? I buried you. She let out a shaky breath, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I know, and I'm so sorry. Her voice broke, but I had no choice. Ryan let out a humorless laugh, disbelief coursing through him like fire. No choice. He took another step toward her, his entire body trembling with the weight of emotions he couldn't contain. "You had a choice, Claire, and you chose to leave me. You chose to let me believe you were dead." Claire's lips quivered, and she looked away, her gaze landing on the floor as if she couldn't bear to see the pain she had caused. "I had to protect Emily." Everything inside Ryan went still. His pulse pounded, his heart slamming against his ribs so hard it hurt. "Emily?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Claire's gaze snapped back to his, her face twisting with raw emotion. "She's alive, Ryan." The words knocked the air from his lungs. He staggered back a step, his fingers gripping the edge of the table behind him for support. His legs suddenly felt weak, like they could collapse beneath him at any moment. "No," he choked out. "No, that's not possible." Claire stepped closer, desperation etched into every line of her face. "It is. She's alive." A sound left Ryan's throat, something between a laugh and a sob. "I saw the reports, Claire. I saw the evidence. She was gone." His voice cracked under the weight of the memory. 10 years. It's been 10 years. "I know," Claire whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know what you went through. I know how much I hurt you. And I swear to you, Ryan, if there had been any other way, if I could have come back sooner, I would have." Her voice broke, raw with pain. "But I couldn't." Ryan shook his head, his mind struggling to process the impossible. His wife, his dead wife, was standing in front of him, telling him their daughter was alive. The daughter he had grieved for, the daughter he had spent sleepless nights searching for, the daughter who had been ripped from his arms. A shuddering breath escaped him. "Where is she?" Claire hesitated, just for a second. It was enough. Ryan's body went rigid, his blood turning to ice. His voice was sharper now, a razor's edge. "Claire, where is our daughter?" Her lips parted, her shoulders trembling, and for the first time since he had seen her, real fear flickered in her expression. "She doesn't remember you." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught, his chest tightening painfully. "What?" Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment before forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Ryan, she doesn't know who you are." He felt his whole body lock up, his heart a thunderous roar in his ears. "No," he said, his voice shaking. "That's not possible." Claire swallowed hard. She was so young when it happened, and they made sure she never remembered you. Ryan's vision blurred, his knees threatening to give out. He couldn't breathe. His daughter, his little girl, didn't know him. The weight of it nearly crushed him. "How?" The word barely escaped his lips. Claire's face crumpled, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I had to make a deal," she whispered. "It was the only way to keep her safe." Ryan's stomach twisted painfully. A deal with who? Claire's silence was deafening. Something dark and terrible settled in his gut. He shook his head, backing away. "No," he muttered. "No, you don't get to do this. You don't get to come back into my life after all these years and give me half-truths. Tell me the truth, Claire." His voice broke. "Tell me why you left me. Tell me why our daughter doesn't know who I am." Claire sucked in a shaky breath. "Because if she did, they would have killed her." The words sent ice through Ryan's veins. His entire body went cold, his breath stalling in his chest. His mind reeled, pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed clicking into place. Emily was alive. Claire had faked her death. And someone had spent the last 10 years making sure his daughter never knew he existed. Rage and grief warred inside him. He took a slow, steadying breath. "Who, Claire?" His voice was dangerously quiet now. "Who took her from me?" Claire hesitated again, and that was all it took. The final confirmation that whoever had done this, whoever had stolen his life, was still out there. Still watching. Still waiting. Ryan clenched his fists, his vision burning with unshed tears. He had spent 10 years drowning in grief, believing his family was gone. But now he was going to get them back. No matter what it took. No matter what he had to uncover. And no matter who tried to stop him. Ryan felt the world around him collapse in on itself. His daughter was alive. His wife had been alive this whole time. And someone had orchestrated this entire nightmare, ensuring that he never found out the truth. His breath was ragged, his heart slamming violently against his ribs. The weight of a decade of grief and searching pressed down on him. But beneath it, a fire burned. He clenched his fists, his mind reeling, pieces of an impossible puzzle shifting into place. Claire had made a deal that had cost him everything. She stood before him, eyes filled with regret, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold together whatever was left of the woman she used to be. But Ryan couldn't focus on that. Not yet. Not when his daughter, his little girl, was still out there somewhere, not knowing he existed. Ryan's voice was low, measured, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that had been honed by years of searching for answers. Who? Claire. His jaw clenched as he took a step closer. Who took her from me? Claire flinched at his tone, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Ryan could see the conflict warring in her eyes. Fear, guilt, pain, but also something else, something darker. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm but not harsh, his fingers trembling against her thin frame. Look at me. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He tightened his hold just slightly, enough to make her focus. Tell me who. She swallowed hard, her breath shaky. Ryan, you don't understand. Then make me understand. He shot back, his voice raw. Because right now, all I see is the woman I buried standing in front of me, telling me that my daughter is alive but doesn't know me. You had 10 years, Claire. 10 years. And you never came back. You let me believe you were dead. His voice cracked, and he forced himself to take a deep breath. So tell me why. Claire's lips trembled. Because if I had come back, you would have died too. The words sent ice through his veins. Ryan released her, his hands falling to his sides as he took a step back, his mind spinning. What? Claire's shoulders shook as fresh tears spilled down her face. They were watching you, Ryan. They were always watching. If I had tried to contact you, if I had even tried to let you know the truth, they would have made sure you never lived long enough to find out. Her voice broke. They threatened to kill you. Ryan's stomach turned, nausea rolling through him. The thought that someone had been watching him, controlling his life without him ever knowing, it made his skin crawl. But there was something else, something more horrifying clawing at the back of his mind. He took a breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. Who are they? Claire shook her head, her fingers gripping the hem of her shirt as if trying to anchor herself. I can't. Ryan slammed his fist against the wooden table, the sound echoing through the cabin. You don't get to do this. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to rein in his emotions. I lost everything, and now, after all this time, I finally have a chance to bring my daughter home. So you're going to tell me who they are. And you're going to tell me now. Claire let out a shaky breath, her eyes red-rimmed, her entire body trembling. They're the ones who took her, Ryan. His pulse spiked. Who? She closed her eyes for a brief second before finally whispering, My brother. Ryan felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him, his entire body locked up, his breath catching in his throat. No, he said immediately, shaking his head. No, that doesn't make sense. Your brother. Matthew? Claire cut in, her voice hoarse. He did this, Ryan. He took her. And I had no choice but to let him. Ryan felt his chest tighten, his lungs constricting like he couldn't get enough air. Matthew had been his brother-in-law, a man he had trusted, a man who had been at the funeral. He had stood next to Ryan as they buried Claire. He had hugged him, and all this time, he had been the one who had taken Emily? Why? The word barely escaped Ryan's lips. Claire hesitated. Ryan's blood boiled. Claire. She looked away, fresh tears slipping down her face. Because Emily wasn't supposed to be ours. The room spun. Ryan took a step back, his mind refusing to process what she had just said. What the hell does that mean? Claire let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand, as if trying to hold back a truth too painful to say out loud. She was never meant to be ours, Ryan. Her voice cracked. She was meant to be his. Ryan's world shattered. A silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. His hands trembled as he reached for the chair behind him, gripping it tightly to keep himself upright. His throat was dry, his mind spinning with disbelief. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. That's not possible." Claire squeezed her eyes shut. "Ryan, please." "No." His voice came out sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. "You're telling me that Matthew, your brother, thought Emily was his child? That's insane, Claire. That's insane." Claire's breathing was ragged, her shoulders shaking. "It's the truth." Ryan's stomach twisted painfully. "Emily is my daughter." His voice wavered. "She's ours, Claire. You know that." Claire sobbed into her hands. "I thought so too." The world around him blurred. The pieces were there, but he refused to put them together. He refused to accept what Claire was implying. But she wasn't done. She lifted her head, her eyes filled with raw, unfiltered pain. "Ryan, I never told you because I didn't want to believe it. But Matthew, he did a DNA test." Her lips quivered, and it confirmed it. "Emily, she's not your biological daughter." Ryan's breath stalled in his chest. It felt like something inside him had just snapped. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. His fingers dug into the wooden chair, his entire body shaking. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not true." Claire broke down into sobs. "I wish it wasn't." Ryan staggered backward, his vision blurring. His head was spinning, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Emily was his. She had always been his. He had held her in his arms, sung her to sleep, watched her take her first steps. None of it could have been a lie. None of it. But Claire's tear-streaked face told him otherwise. His legs gave out, and he sank into the chair, his hands trembling violently. His entire world had just been torn apart. Emily wasn't his, and Matthew had taken her because he believed she was. Ryan squeezed his eyes shut, his breath shallow, his mind screaming in protest. He had spent 10 years searching for his daughter. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure she had ever been his to begin with. Ryan sat in the chair, his entire body numb, his mind spiraling into a place he had never known before. A place where nothing made sense, where reality itself had betrayed him. Emily wasn't his. The words echoed in his head, deafening, relentless. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as if holding on to something solid would stop his world from crumbling beneath him. Claire sat across from him, her face stained with tears, her hands clutching at the fabric of her shirt like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. But Ryan couldn't look at her. Not now. Not after what she had just said. Emily wasn't his. The little girl he had spent 10 years mourning. The child whose laughter had once filled their home. The daughter he had sworn to find, no matter what it took. She wasn't his. His chest ached with something unbearable, something he didn't have words for. It was grief, but not the kind he had known before. It was worse, because this wasn't just about losing Emily. It was about losing everything he had built around her. Every memory, every promise, every moment he had spent loving her. A broken laugh escaped him, bitter and sharp. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, shaking his head as the weight of it all settled over him. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice raw. "This can't be real." Claire swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." Ryan let out another humorless laugh. "Do you?" His gaze snapped to hers, something dark and unfamiliar flickering in his eyes. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you knew this whole time. And you let me believe she was mine." His voice cracked. "You let me grieve for a child that was never mine to begin with." Claire's face crumpled. "I didn't know, Ryan. Not at first." Her breath hitched. "And by the time I found out, it was too late. I didn't—" She broke off, covering her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't want it to be true." Ryan pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. His hands were shaking, his legs unsteady beneath him. But he couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't listen to this. "You should have told me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Claire wiped at her tears, nodding frantically. I know, and I wanted to, but then Matthew, he knew before I did. He took the test behind my back. And when he saw the results..." She closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the memory. "He said Emily was never mine to keep." Ryan's stomach turned. He braced himself against the back of the chair, his grip tightening. "And that's why he took her." Claire nodded, her voice hollow. "He thought he was saving her." A bitter taste filled Ryan's mouth. Saving her? His jaw clenched, his chest burning. "He stole her, Claire. He ripped her away from me. From you." Claire let out a shuddering breath. "And I had to make a choice." Her eyes met his, broken and desperate. "If I fought him, he would have disappeared with her forever. I wouldn't have known where she was, if she was safe. So She hesitated. Ryan's pulse pounded. "So you what?" Claire exhaled shakily. "So I let him take me too." Ryan froze. The cabin went silent, the weight of her words sinking in. She had gone with Matthew. She had chosen to leave with him. The realization sent a fresh wave of pain crashing through him. Claire's eyes filled with new tears. "I had to, Ryan. I had to stay close to her. I had to make sure she was okay." She wiped at her face, her fingers trembling. "And it killed me. Every single day, it killed me knowing what I had done to you, knowing what I had left behind." Ryan's breathing was ragged, his mind a whirlwind of emotions he couldn't control. "Why didn't you come back?" His voice was quiet now, raw with pain. Claire swallowed hard. "Because he never let me." Ryan clenched his jaw. Claire took a deep breath. "After a few years, Emily didn't remember me the way she used to. Matthew raised her as his own. He told her things, changed things, and I couldn't fight him, Ryan. If I tried to leave, if I tried to reach out to you, he would have taken her and disappeared." Ryan's hands balled into fists at his sides. He couldn't even process the kind of manipulation Matthew must have used to erase him from Emily's memory, to make her forget the father who had loved her more than anything. His heart twisted painfully. "Where is she now?" Claire hesitated. Ryan's patience snapped. "Claire, where is she?" She sucked in a breath, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. "At the farmhouse." Ryan's entire body went rigid. The farmhouse, the same place that had started all of this. His mind spun. The blue envelopes, the messages, the photograph of Emily that had appeared out of nowhere. Had someone been trying to lead him there all along? Had someone been waiting for him to find her? His breath came in sharp bursts as he turned toward the door, his feet already moving. "We're going," he said, his voice steel. Claire scrambled to her feet. "Ryan!" But he didn't stop. He stormed out of the cabin, the weight of 10 years pressing down on him, suffocating, burning. He had spent too long searching, too long grieving, and now, finally, he was going to bring Emily home. Ryan drove faster than he should have, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The road stretched out before him, a blur of faded asphalt and memories he could no longer trust. Claire sat beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring out the window as if the weight of everything they had just uncovered was pressing her further and further into her seat. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, a silhouette against the dying light of the afternoon sun. It looked different now, less like an abandoned relic of the past and more like something alive, waiting. Ryan's chest tightened as he pulled the car to a stop, gravel crunching beneath the tires. He barely had time to kill the engine before he was already pushing the door open, stepping out into the thick, suffocating air. Claire hesitated before following, her breath shaky, her hands trembling at her sides. "Ryan, we need to be careful." He ignored her. His entire body was tense, his senses on high alert as he scanned the property. The last time he had been here, he had found a little girl standing by the garbage bins, pointing to the blue envelope that had led him deeper into this nightmare. But now the space was empty. No little girl. No messages waiting for him. Just silence. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. His heart pounded against his ribs as he approached the porch, the same place where the last envelope had been left. He half expected to find another one waiting for him, another cryptic message pushing him toward the next piece of the puzzle. But there was nothing, just the wind and the distant creak of the old house settling into itself. Claire stopped beside him, her breath unsteady. "She's here." Ryan didn't hesitate. He reached for the door, pushing it open. The house groaned in protest, the hinges whining as if waking from a decade-long slumber. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the dim light that filtered through the cracked windows. Everything was exactly as he had left it, the furniture draped in white sheets, the rocking chair near the window swaying ever so slightly. And then, a sound, soft, faint, a whisper of movement coming from the second floor. Ryan's entire body went rigid. He turned to Claire, his breath shallow. "Stay here." She grabbed his arm. "Ryan, don't." But he was already moving. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his pulse hammering as he reached the landing. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that led to rooms he had searched before. But this time something was different. The door at the very end was open. He swallowed hard, his footsteps careful, measured. The house seemed to hold its breath around him as he stepped inside. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was Emily. Ryan's heart stopped. She was older now, no longer the 2-year-old he had lost, but a girl of 12, standing stiffly in the dim light. Her hair was longer, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, his eyes, stared at him with something unreadable. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. Ryan's breath came in uneven bursts, his vision blurring. "Emily?" His voice was barely more than a whisper. She flinched at the sound of her name. Ryan felt his throat tighten. He wanted to run to her, to pull her into his arms, to tell her how much he had missed her, how much he had searched for her. But something in the way she stood, rigid, cautious, kept him rooted in place. She didn't recognize him. The realization hit him like a knife to the chest. She had no idea who he was. Emily took a step back, her hands clenching at the fabric of her dress. "Who are you?" Ryan's world shattered. His lips parted, his lungs burning, but no words came. Claire's voice broke through the silence behind him, soft but urgent. "Emily, sweetheart, it's okay." Emily's head snapped toward her, her brows furrowing. "Mom!" Claire let out a choked sob, nodding desperately. "Yes, baby, it's me." Emily took another step back. "No, you're lying." Her voice trembled. "You're not my mom." Claire's breath hitched. "Emily, please." "No," Emily said, shaking her head. Her voice rose, panic bleeding into her tone. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." Ryan's chest ached. He had imagined this moment so many times. Finding her, bringing her home. But this was a nightmare he hadn't prepared for. Emily's hands balled into fists, her entire body tense. "Where's my dad?" Ryan's breath stalled. Claire's face crumpled. "Sweetheart, this is your dad." Emily's eyes snapped back to him, her expression unreadable. Then she whispered, "No, my dad is Matthew." Ryan felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. His body locked up, his ears ringing. Matthew, the man who had stolen his daughter. The man who had spent the last 10 years rewriting history. Emily didn't know him because she had never been allowed to. Ryan swallowed against the lump in his throat, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Emily," he said carefully, "I am your dad." She shook her head violently. "That's not true." "It is true," Claire pleaded. "Matthew lied to you. He took you from us." Emily's breathing turned shallow. No, he wouldn't do that." Ryan took a careful step forward. "Emily, listen to me. When you were 2 years old, you were taken from us. I looked for you. I never stopped looking for you." His voice cracked. "I love you. I have always loved you." Tears welled in her eyes, her lips quivering. Stop. Ryan took another step. Baby, please. Just let me. A voice cut through the silence, sharp and commanding. Step away from her. Ryan turned sharply, his pulse spiking. Matthew stood in the doorway. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his presence filled the room like a force of nature. He looked the same, older perhaps, but still the man Ryan remembered. The man who had once been family, and the man who had stolen everything from him. Matthew's gaze flickered to Emily, his voice steady. It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here. Emily let out a choked sob, running toward him. Dad! Ryan felt something inside him break as she clung to Matthew's side, the only father she had ever known. Matthew's eyes met Ryan's over Emily's head, something dark and victorious flashing in them. And that's when Ryan realized this wasn't just about losing Emily. Matthew had won. For 10 years, he had molded Emily into the daughter he wanted. For 10 years, he had erased Ryan from her life. And now, even standing face to face with the truth, Emily still chose him. Ryan's hands clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling. This wasn't over. Not yet. And no matter what it took, he was going to fight for her. Because she was his daughter. And he wasn't letting her go again. Ryan felt the air in the room shift, the weight of 10 years pressing down on him as he stood face to face with the man who had stolen everything from him. Matthew, his brother-in-law, the man he had once trusted, the man who had stood beside him at Claire's funeral, looked him in the eye and offered condolences for a loss that he had orchestrated. And now, he stood there with Ryan's daughter clinging to his side, looking up at him like he was the only father she had ever known. Ryan's stomach twisted painfully, his fists clenching at his sides. He had spent 10 years searching, grieving, hoping. And now, as the truth unraveled before him, he realized that hope had been a cruel illusion. Because no matter how much he had dreamed of this moment, no matter how desperately he had longed for Emily to recognize him, she didn't. She didn't know him. Matthew ran a hand gently over Emily's hair, his eyes never leaving Ryan's. There was something unsettling in his gaze. Not fear, not remorse, but something else. Something colder. Something that made Ryan's skin crawl. I was wondering when you'd finally put the pieces together, Matthew said, his voice even, controlled. Ryan's jaw clenched. He could feel Claire stiffen beside him, her breath shallow, her hands curled into tight fists. She had been afraid of this moment, and now he understood why. Matthew wasn't just someone who had taken Emily out of desperation. He was someone who had planned this, controlled this, for 10 years. Ryan's voice came out low, steady. She's my daughter. Matthew tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile ghosting over his lips. That's where you're wrong. Ryan took a step forward, the rage in his chest barely contained. You stole her from me. His breath was unsteady, his body trembling. You let me believe she was dead. Do you have any idea what that did to me? Matthew sighed, as if he were tired of having this conversation. Ryan, I didn't steal her. I saved her. He glanced down at Emily, his voice softening. I gave her a life. A good one. Ryan's entire body locked up. A life without her real parents? His voice cracked. A life built on lies? Matthew exhaled through his nose, like he was growing impatient. A life where she wasn't constantly in danger. Ryan froze. His pulse spiked. Danger. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. What are you talking about? Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's jaw tightened. His grip on Emily's shoulder was firm but not forceful. Protective. Ryan took another step forward, his chest burning with frustration. Tell me the truth, Matthew. All of it. No more lies. No more half-truths. You took Emily. You took Claire. You rewrote history. Why? Matthew's eyes darkened. Because if I hadn't, she wouldn't have survived. Ryan's breath stalled in his chest. The room was too quiet, too still. Claire's fingers dug into Ryan's wrist, as if she needed something to hold on to. What do you mean? Matthew exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before looking back at them. You think I wanted to do this? His voice was sharper now, laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "You think I wanted to rip your family apart? You don't know the whole story, Ryan." His gaze flickered to Claire. "Neither of you do." Ryan's pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel it now, the truth, sitting just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. The final piece of the puzzle. Matthew's eyes softened as he looked down at Emily, who was still watching the exchange with wide, confused eyes. "She was never safe with you." Ryan flinched, his breath catching in his throat. "What?" Matthew's gaze snapped back to him. "Think, Ryan. Do you really believe her disappearance was an accident? Do you really think it was some random act of cruelty?" He let out a bitter laugh. "No, it was planned. And if I hadn't stepped in, she wouldn't be alive today." The words sent a cold shiver down Ryan's spine. His mind reeled. Who? The word barely made it past his lips. Who wanted to hurt her? Matthew hesitated, just for a second. Then he said it. "Your father." Ryan's world cracked open. His stomach dropped. His vision blurred. For a moment he forgot how to breathe. "No," he whispered, his throat tight. "No, that's not possible." Matthew's expression was unreadable. "It's the truth." Ryan shook his head violently. "My father is dead." Matthew's gaze didn't waver. "Because I made sure he was." Ryan felt like he was drowning. His thoughts spiraled, memories flashing through his mind at a dizzying pace. His father had been a complicated man. Strict, cold. But he would never. Claire's breath hitched beside him. "Oh my God," she whispered, a hand covering her mouth. Matthew let out a slow breath. He found out. His voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "About Emily. About the DNA test." Ryan's stomach turned. His father had known. Matthew's expression darkened. "He wanted to make sure you never found out. He was willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried." Ryan could barely think. His father, the man who had raised him, the man who had taught him how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to be strong. Had he really been capable of something like this? No. Yes. The pieces clicked together. The way his father had reacted when Emily was born. The way he had distanced himself, barely acknowledging her existence. The arguments Ryan could barely remember. The tension in the air whenever Emily was mentioned. The night she disappeared. Ryan had blamed himself for not protecting her, for not seeing the signs. But the threat had been inside his own family all along. His stomach lurched. He tried to. Matthew nodded. Ryan's entire body felt numb. His father had tried to have his own granddaughter killed, and Matthew had stopped him. Ryan's breaths came in sharp, shallow bursts, his world collapsing in on itself. Matthew's voice was quiet. "I didn't take her to hurt you, Ryan. I took her to save her." Ryan looked at Emily, his daughter, not by blood, but by everything else that mattered. She didn't know him, didn't remember him, but she was alive. And now, finally, he knew why. The silence stretched between them, thick with years of betrayal, pain, and impossible choices. Ryan exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. "Where do we go from here?" Matthew's eyes softened. "That's up to you." Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat, his gaze locking onto Emily's. She was watching him, really watching him. And for the first time, she didn't look afraid. For the first time, she looked like she was starting to see him. Ryan's voice broke as he whispered, "Hi, sweetheart." Emily hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered back, "Hi." Ryan felt the weight of the past 10 years pressing down on him as he stood there, staring into Emily's eyes. That single word, "Hi," was the first bridge between them, the first thread tying them together again after a decade apart. His chest ached, his hands trembled, but for the first time since this nightmare began, there was something other than grief in his heart. There was hope. Emily shifted uncomfortably, still clinging to Matthew's side. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his sleeve as if anchoring herself to the only life she had ever known. Ryan didn't expect her to come running into his arms. He knew that this wasn't the reunion he had imagined. that no amount of longing could undo what had been done. She didn't remember him, but she was here. She was safe, and she was alive. Matthew sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Ryan," he said slowly, carefully, "you know the truth now. You know why I did what I did." His voice softened. "But knowing the truth doesn't change the fact that she doesn't know you." Ryan's jaw tightened. He knew what Matthew was trying to say, that Emily had spent the last 10 years knowing only him as her father. That in her mind, Ryan wasn't someone she had lost. He was a stranger, a decade of stolen time. Ryan swallowed against the lump in his throat, his voice hoarse. "I don't expect her to remember." His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "But I am her father, and I want to be in her life." Matthew exhaled through his nose, his jaw flexing. "That's not your decision to make." Ryan's chest burned with frustration. "No, but it's hers." Emily flinched slightly at the intensity in his voice. Ryan immediately softened his tone, forcing himself to take a slow, steady breath. "Emily," he said gently, "I know this is a lot. I know you don't know me." His throat tightened. "But I know you. I have always known you." Her lips pressed together, her small fingers still gripping Matthew's sleeve like a lifeline. But she didn't look away. Ryan took a careful step forward. "When you were little, you used to laugh in your sleep," he said quietly. "Every night. And when you were upset, you'd scrunch up your nose, just like your mom does." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "You loved bedtime stories, but you always wanted to change the endings. You didn't like how they were written, so you'd make me tell them your way." He let out a shaky breath. "You were 2 years old when I lost you, and for 10 years, I never stopped looking." Emily's eyes glistened, her lower lip trembling. Matthew's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly. "Ryan." "No," Claire said suddenly, stepping forward. Her voice was unsteady but firm. "Let her listen." Matthew's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. Ryan swallowed hard. "I know you don't remember me," he said, his voice raw. "And I know you don't have any reason to trust me. But his breath shuddered. "I just want the chance to know you again." Emily's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Hesitation, confusion, fear, but not rejection. And that was enough. She looked up at Matthew, her brows furrowed, her voice uncertain. "Is it true?" Matthew tensed beside her. "Emily, is it true?" she pressed, her voice shaking. Matthew hesitated for a long moment before exhaling slowly. "Yes." A sharp breath escaped her lips. She took a small, unsteady step back, as if the floor beneath her had just shifted. She was struggling to process it all. The life she had known. The memories that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Ryan could see the walls closing in around her. "Emily," he said gently, "you don't have to make any decisions right now." He swallowed hard. "But I don't want to disappear again. I don't want to be a stranger." His voice broke slightly. "I just want to be your dad." She stared at him, her lips trembling, but she didn't run. She didn't deny him. Matthew's expression darkened. "This isn't that simple." Ryan turned to him, his eyes burning. "You made it complicated." Matthew's face hardened. "I protected her." Ryan's fists clenched. "You stole her." The air in the room was thick with tension, the weight of a decade pressing down on both of them. Emily watched them both, her breath shaky, as if she was seeing Matthew in a way she never had before. And then, in the softest voice, she whispered, "Can I talk to him?" Matthew stiffened. Ryan felt his heart stop. Claire inhaled sharply, her hands pressed over her mouth. Emily's small hands curled into fists at her sides, her face pale but determined. Just for a little bit. Matthew hesitated, his entire body tense. Then, finally, he stepped back. Ryan felt the air leave his lungs. Emily turned to him slowly, hesitant, unsure. She wasn't ready to embrace him. She wasn't ready to trust him. But she was ready to try, and that was more than Ryan had ever hoped for. He swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that burned at the edges of his vision. "I'd like that," he whispered. Emily nodded once, then looked at Matthew. "It's okay." Matthew exhaled, running a hand down his face before nodding stiffly. He didn't like this. That much was obvious. But this was no longer his choice to make. For the first time in 10 years, Emily had a choice. Ryan felt his chest tighten as she stepped closer, her hands still shaking. "I don't remember you," she admitted quietly. Ryan forced a smile, his heart aching. "That's okay." She swallowed hard. "But I think I want to." The words nearly shattered him. He let out a breathless laugh, his hands trembling. "That's all I need." Emily hesitated for a long moment before slowly, so slowly, reaching out a hand. Ryan stared at it, his vision blurring. Then, with a careful breath, he reached out and took it. Her fingers were small in his, hesitant, uncertain, but they were there. For the first time in 10 years, his daughter was there, and she wasn't letting go. Ryan closed his eyes, his breath shuddering. He had spent a decade searching for her. And now, finally, she had found him,